Okay, so welcome everyone once again to our agroecology webinar series. My name is Evelyn Zuniga, and I'm one of the communications officers for the Agroecology Partnership Project. What is the Agroecology Partnership? This project officially started in January 2024 and is funded under the Horizon Europe program. It currently unites the European Commission and 72 partners across 26 member states, associated countries, and third countries. This partnership seeks to support the agriculture sector to meet the targets and challenges from climate change, biodiversity loss, food security and sovereignty, and the environment. It combines the resources of the European Commission and the participating countries to fund research that aligns with different aspects of sustainable practices in agriculture. In our last webinars, we have the fortune to have Dr. John Finn presenting some interesting aspects of his research in multi-species swards. So if you're interested in this topic, the recording is now available in the Agroecology Partnership YouTube channel. Just a very quick housekeeping announcement. You can type your questions in the Q&A and the chat section at any time. I'm going to do my best to address as many as I can with the time that we have today, which is around 45 minutes. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Chiara de Notaris, who is a researcher at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change at the Division on Climate Change Impacts on Agriculture, Forests, and Ecosystems in Viterbo, Italy. Dr. De Notaris is a leading researcher in agroecology and sustainable agricultural practices, specializing in the role of cover crops and nitrogen management in improving soil health, enhancing crop productivity, and mitigating climate change. Her work integrates advanced field experiments, long-term crop rotation studies, and critical assessments for agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And since 2022, she has been actively working with climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies within different European projects. Dr. De Notaris, thank you very much for joining us today. We're very happy to have you here to give us your talk about agroecological practices and climate change impacts and trade-offs. So I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen and you can start your presentation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I will now share my screen.
Yes.
So,
perfect.
Yeah, as Evelyn already introduced, I'm Chiara de Notaris. I'm a researcher at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. The CMCC Foundation is spread all over Italy. I am based in Viterbo in the division that works on impacts on agriculture, forestry, and other ecosystem services. And today I'm going to talk about agroecological practices and climate change. And in particular, I will focus a bit on impacts, but also on possible trade-offs. The agenda for today, I will start with some introductions. Evelyn already introduced me really well, so this will be brief. And then I will go through some key concepts about climate change and agroecology, to then focus on how agroecological practices can contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and then have some little reflections on the way forward, and we will have time for comments and questions at the end. So since 2022, I'm a junior scientist at the CMCC Foundation. But before then, I studied and worked for almost 8 years in Denmark at the Department of Agroecology at Aarhus University, where together with my colleagues, we started a series of videos actually on agroecology, which you can still find on the YouTube channel of the Department of Agroecology of Aarhus University. Sorry. In these videos, we try to dig a bit into the concept of agroecology and how agroecology can be implemented in different contexts, including smallholder farmers, but also some perspectives on policy and more. So if you're curious, you can have a look at the videos. And these is because agroecology is among my main interests, together with climate change mitigation and adaptation, scientific communication, and lately also policy support. But let's start with a few slides on climate change. Climate change is a crisis. This is clearer than ever as the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has stressed in their latest report. What they say in the report from 2022 is that we should be keeping global warming to close to 1.5 degrees Celsius to limit the damages that are caused from climate change and the risks associated, well, in general, the concept of risk, and in particular, the risk associated to climate change depends on the vulnerability, exposure, level of socioeconomic development, and adaptation. So we have to limit global warming, and on the other hand, we also need to adapt to the changes that are already occurring in order to keep the risks limited. So 1.5 degrees Celsius is the threshold, the safe threshold for humanity, at least. The bad news is that 2024 is the first year where the average global temperature is above 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. Of course, this is not enough to say that, okay, now we went over the threshold, it's just 1 year, and this estimate is still provisional. But it's a clear indication that we are not really going in the right direction at the moment. And the projections from the IPCC tell us that in order to stay not within 1.5 degrees, not within an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius, but 2 degrees, we need to undertake the sustainability pathway. They make several scenarios for their simulations, and one of the scenarios is this sustainability scenario. And this scenario is characterized by more inclusive development that respects perceived environmental boundaries, education and health investments. It puts emphasis on human well-being and reducing inequalities. And it also stresses how material growth should be low, so that lower resources and energy are used. So these are projections, of course, but so far they have been relatively accurate. So it's needed to stay within a safe boundary for humanity that we undertake a shift towards a sustainability pathway. And how can agroecology contribute to this type of scenario? According to the FAO, agroecology is characterized by 10 elements, and some of these elements are very well aligned with the socioeconomic pathway that could enable us to stay within an increasing global temperature that is safe. In particular, for example, the focus on human and social values, circular and solidarity economy, and also all the aspects related to staying within safe environmental boundaries, so increasing diversity, resilience, efficiency, recycling, and so on. So agroecology fits very well within the scenario, the best scenario that we should hope to undertake. And if we look at the definitions of agroecology, we have several. They have evolved in time, but some elements stay the same. So agroecology is an integrative approach to food systems. So it deals with food systems not only agricultural production, but food systems intended as a whole. And it focuses on the three pillars of sustainability, so ecological, economic, and social dimensions. And in addition to that, agroecology is characterized by three pillars that are the science, the practice, and a social movement pillar. So it's not only about the science or the practice, but it also includes the social movement aspect. So again, very well aligned with the shared socioeconomic pathway of sustainability. And the FAO also looked at which sustainable development goals can be reached, or to which sustainable development goals agroecology can contribute to. One of them is climate change resilience. And in particular, the way agroecology can contribute to climate change resilience is to improve the ability of agriculture and food systems in facing climate shocks and stressors. And it can also promote greater carbon sequestration, increase resilience of livelihoods, and provide climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions. These two concepts refer to what I said at the beginning, so that we both need to limit global warming, so mitigate climate change, but also adapt to the consequences of the changes that are already happening. To say it with the words of the IPCC, mitigation is a human intervention to reduce emissions or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. So the focus of mitigation is reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, while the focus of adaptation is on adjusting to actual or expected climate and its effects. And importantly, the aim is not only to moderate harm, but also exploit beneficial opportunities. Okay, so these two concepts ideally should go hand in hand. It's not either mitigation or adaptation. We need to do both. In a report that was focused on climate change and land, the IPCC looked at how food systems can respond to climate change from a mitigation and adaptation point of view. And the response options that relate to food systems are including many agroecological practices. For example, changing crop variety, increased soil organic matter content, integrated pest management, agroforestry, and more. And the interesting part here is that there's a very good alignment between mitigation and adaptation. So there seem to be no trade-offs in this sense. So options that have high or very high mitigation potential can also deliver a high or very high adaptation effect. So agroecological practices have this very important characteristic that they can actually address both mitigation and adaptation simultaneously. And while we talk about this, it's important to also remember that agriculture is a source of greenhouse gases. In the latest report from the IPCC, they assessed greenhouse gas emissions from human activities per economic sector. And the sector that includes agroecology is called AFOLU, which is agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. And it's the second sector after industry for direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very big contribution to greenhouse gas emissions that comes from the larger agricultural sector. And if we only look at strictly agricultural practices, it's 11% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from from these, and it's mostly methane and nitrous oxide. So these two greenhouse gases have a global warming potential that it's even higher compared to carbon dioxide. So agriculture is significantly contributing to climate change. And this is why it's important to not only look at how we can increase the resilience of our agricultural systems, but we also need to look at ways for reducing the negative impacts of agriculture on climate. And how can agroecology do this? How can agroecology contribute to mitigation of climate change? Well, the agroecological practices can be understood can be grouped into categories. There are practices that are focused on increasing the efficiency of the cropping system or the agricultural system. And these practices include, for example, cultivar choice, split fertilization, use of organic fertilizers. So the aim here is to reducing inputs, and when inputs are needed, preferring inputs that can also bring additional carbon, for example, to the soil, like using organic fertilizers. And then there are redesign practices that are more focused on diversifying cropping systems, for example, increasing diversity of cultivars or having more diversity in space and time, like with crop rotations or using cover crops. But in any case, the focus is on using less input in a better way. And while requiring less input, agroecological practices are very knowledge intensive. So all these practices can be effective also only if accompanied by a large knowledge related to the context where they are applied. And when it comes to how agroecological practices can contribute to adaptation to climate change, well, one main effect of agroecological practices is that they can increase the functioning of agroecosystems. What this means is that agroecosystems, when agroecological practices are adopted, agroecosystems in general are more able to deliver ecosystem services such as water retention, infiltration, nutrient availability, but also increasing soil health in general, biodiversity. And all this can help agroecosystems to be more resilient in the face of climate change. So it's, again, an integrated approach that in general aims at increasing the functionality of agroecosystems. And again, this is taken from a recent study from Aguilera et al. They looked at how different agroecological practices can contribute to several ecosystem services. Regulation services. Among regulation services, there are some that are very much related to climate change mitigation, such as greenhouse gas mitigation, but also increasing soil organic matter. And the ones that I put here, so they are the ones that I put here in the red rectangle. And as you can see, the squares are green, which means that these agroecological practices have a positive effect on these regulation services. So again, there's a synergy between adaptation and mitigation. But to come to some more juicy things, I will use an example. As Evelyn said in her introduction, I worked with cover crops for quite some time. and in particular looking at nitrogen cycling in relation to cover crops, but also soil organic carbon. The effect of cover crops on nutrients and carbon in the soil is that they are able to recycle nutrients, therefore also reducing the need for inputs. And this has an effect on greenhouse gas emissions, because greenhouse gas emissions are associated to the input of fertilizers, but also to nutrient losses. Some of the nitrogen, for example, that is lost via leaching can be then lost again as nitrous oxide, or it can be directly lost as nitrous oxide. So by keeping the nutrients in the system, so recycling them, cover crops can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then because they are grown during otherwise unproductive periods, it's an additional source of carbon to the soil. So they take up carbon in their biomass through photosynthesis, and then when the biomass is returned to the soil, it's an additional input of carbon that can lead to carbon sequestration in the soil. So less carbon in the atmosphere, more in the soil. Recently, there have been several studies looking at the effect of cover crops on nitrogen losses, but also soil organic carbon. And these global estimates tell us that cover crops are able to reduce to up to 70% nitrate leaching and increase soil organic carbon by approximately 15% compared to bare fallow. So if you don't have cover crops, or if you have cover crops, it makes a big difference. These are global estimates. When we look at experimental results, we might get some different a different picture. And I will use some of my own results to talk about this. Of course, again, this is just examples. And well, in one of the systems, one of the agricultural systems where I worked the most during my years in Denmark was a long-term field experiment. In this long-term field experiment, we looked at how cover crops were able to reduce nitrate leaching. And what we could see was that indeed they were able to reduce nitrate leaching in line with the global estimates that I showed you before. So the red rectangle here is treatments with cover crops, and the blue is without cover crops. The relation between nitrate leaching and nitrogen surplus here tell us that they were correlated, but without the cover crops, nitrate leaching was significantly higher. And then, since in our system we also had leguminous species in the cover crop mixtures, we also assessed that having the legumes in the cover crop mixture could actually provide even more nitrogen to the system. So up to 90% of the nitrogen that was found in cover crop biomass came from biological nitrogen fixation. This was with red clover. And interestingly, this didn't increase the risk of nitrate leaching. To say it in more simple words, cover crops were able to reduce nitrate leaching irrespective of the cover crop species, as long as they were grown in mixtures. So mixing species with different functionalities ensured that nitrate leaching was reduced. And then we also looked at soil organic carbon in the same long-term experiment. The first picture here, the first figure here on the left shows soil organic carbon with cover crops and without cover crops in 2019. What we could see was that there was a tendency for a slightly higher soil organic carbon with cover crops compared to without. But then we looked at the temporal development of soil organic carbon in this long-term experiment. And what we could see was that this apparent difference in 2019 was actually just a reflection of an initial difference that was already there since the beginning of the experiment. So it was due to the experimental design. So in reality, in this specific experiment, cover crops didn't have an effect on soil organic carbon. And then we looked at the input of carbon from the cover crops in the soil, and by taking into account all biomass, so above ground biomass, root biomass, and the carbon that was deposited in the soil, for example, through rhizodeposition, what we could estimate, because of course it's always an estimate with carbon input, was that less than 1 ton per hectare of carbon was added to the soil from the cover crops, which was half than the average that was estimated from global meta-analysis. So maybe this was the reason why we couldn't see an effect on soil organic carbon, because the input of carbon was maybe too low. And then the last point that I wanted to make is about possible trade-offs. As I said, in general, when we look at agroecological practices, they have potential for both adaptation and mitigation. So we don't really see a big trade-off there, because in general, they act in synergy. But for example, when we specifically look at mitigation, climate change mitigation, there actually might be trade-offs between greenhouse gases. In this study from Lugato and colleagues, they assessed how the positive effect on carbon sequestration derived from cover crops might be counteracted by increased nitrous oxide emissions, especially with legumes. This is because of that extra input of nitrogen that I told you about before. So when it's not only the nitrogen in the system that is recycled, but you have additional nitrogen coming in, this might lead to increased nitrous oxide emissions. And this might actually counteract the positive effect on carbon. But also, this is not always the case, because how cover crops are managed is actually important in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases. In this other study, you can see it from this box here. This is the net greenhouse gas. So in this other study, what they saw is that when integrated management of cover crop was adopted, then the net effect was actually close to zero. So there were no trade-offs in this scenario. And the last slide here about these results or more insights is that also in this case, it's very context specific. In this study, they assessed how keeping residues in the field could actually significantly increase nitrous oxide emissions, especially when the residues were from immature crops, such as cover crops. So indeed, cover crops can increase nitrous oxide emissions. But in another study, very recently published, they quantified cumulative nitrous oxide emissions from different cover crop species, and they compared it to a control without cover crops. And what they could see is that not all cover crop species significantly increased nitrous oxide emissions. And interestingly, it was a non-legume, so it was oilseed radish, the only one who significantly increased nitrous oxide emissions. Crimson clover and hairy vetch had slightly higher nitrous oxide emissions compared to the control, but it was not significantly higher. So again, everything is the opposite of everything, it seems like. And here I come to my last slide, the way forward. I think the answer here to all this potentially very confusing um, overview that I just gave is that no one solution fits all. And this is the beauty of agroecology. It's very, very context specific, and that is why it's also very knowledge intensive. And again, no one solution fits all contexts, and that's why integration between traditional knowledge and scientific progress is needed to identify the best solutions for the specific context. But this also requires a significant advancement in our understanding of biological, chemical, and physical processes that are behind, in this case, climate change mitigation and adaptation. So all the processes that lead, for example, to nitrous oxide emissions and soil organic carbon sequestration, because this will enable us to predict and support decision making. So deciding which solutions are best suited for the specific context that is addressed. And importantly, social values are very important to be considered, because maybe sometimes the solutions that are theoretically the best for the specific context might not be accepted. Again, just to make an example, in the case of cover crops, a solution could be removing residues from the field and using them, for example, for biogas production, and then returning the digestate to the field. But this is not, is almost never well accepted by farmers. So it might be a solution in theory, but maybe not in practice. So again, I think the way forward is to actually embrace the fact that agroecology is knowledge intensive and context specific, and keep digging into the processes that are behind what we are observing. And that's it from my side. And now I think we do have time for some discussions.
Yes, indeed, we do have time. Thank you very much, Dr. De Notaris, for your presentation. It was like very enriching because it's just like kind of the generic stuff, but you see that there's so much behind all the problems that we have to face. And we have a first question here. It says, what are the strategies for livestock production in agroecology that could help to reduce greenhouse gas emission, or is it mostly plant production that has a role in agroecology?
No, indeed. I mean, livestock production is an integral part of food systems. So it is very important for agroecology. It's just that it is not my personal focus. So, and that's why I didn't talk much about it, but it has a role in agroecology. And one of the roles, I could say, again, I'm not an expert in livestock, so I will not go in much detail, but it's that currently the production, food production, have either crop production or livestock production in most cases. One of the things that would help to increase the efficiency of food systems is to have more integrated production. So keeping animals and crops together. And that, for example, would allow for a better recycling of nutrients, because you can reuse the manure in the system. So that would be a way.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen that before, and like when there has been like some talks about mixed farming systems where you kind of collect all the residues and then you give it to the cows, and then the farmers kind of themselves kind of they network and then they exchange what could be used by the other one. Yeah, that's true. Um,
And
I
exactly
yeah.
as I was saying, that would also allow valorizing crop residues.
Hmm.
For example, crops. I mean, they could be used as feed.
Exactly. Yes. We have another question. It says, would farmers be able to accept the strategy of using mixed cover cropping as they would lose a portion of land use for main crop and maybe the reduced yield, which is difficult to compensate with? That's tricky, yes.
But they wouldn't necessarily lose land for crop production because the point of cover crops is that they are grown in between cash crops. So
Um,
you don't really need to lose the production, if I understood the question correctly.
oh, okay.
So you
Maybe he was
have
thinking about like mix your main crop with cover crop, but in your case, is the cover crop goes away and then you put your main once your soil has recovered.
there are several ways of doing cover cropping. So you could either have them as intercrops.
Uh,
So you put them in the system while the cash crop is still there. That's one way. For example, in the case of crops that are grown in rows, you can put the cover crop in between the rows and then have them stay while the after the cash crop is harvested, you still have the cover crops there. That's
uh,
one way. If you have crops that don't allow sowing the cover crops in between the rows, then you sow them after the cash crop is harvested. But this really depends on the system again. I mean, the concept of cover crops is to keep the soil covered. And then there are several ways of doing it. Just to make an example with soy, the canopy of soy is very tight, so you cannot really put a cover crop underneath
mm,
soy. I mean, you can, but it will probably not grow. So in that case, it doesn't make sense to intercrop them, maybe.
oh,
But then you can still sow it after the soy cash crop is harvested. Keep the cover crop there until the next cash crop, and then you keep going. But it depends on the system.
all right. So there is no like kind of like like as in what would be better for the soil to have like intercropping or like cover and then remove and then put your cash crop. It depends on.
Exactly. It
Okay.
depends on the crops that you have and on the also on the meteorological conditions. I mean, um, in some cases, like in Southern Europe, sometimes having a cover crop can actually be not ideal in terms of water availability for the following crop. If you have very limited water, you put a cover crop there, it takes up the water, and then
Yeah.
you don't have it for the following crop. That might not be ideal. So again, as all agroecological practices, it's not, you cannot really say cover crops are good and that's it. I mean, they are good all the time.
Mhm.
They can be good. It depends on the system, and how you manage it depends on the system. But potentially, they can be very good to
Okay.
keep the soil covered.
Mhm. Okay. Somebody's saying here, um, I have a solution which I believe would help reduction of nitrous oxides emissions from hydroponic farmers, but I'm not sure how to justify this solution. Any suggestions?
Um, so that having hydroponic farms would allow recycling nitrogen. Is that, but so I think if I understand the question is how to justify hydroponic in agroecological systems.
Yeah,
Is
maybe
this
that instead of using that the nitrous oxide reduction would be less if you use hydroponics compared to kind of growing stuff in soil.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is a debate because
Mm.
also in the organic context, soil is needed. I mean, yeah, I mean, personally, so now I'm speaking for myself. I think hydroponic and vertical farming and all of that can be great solutions in some contexts. So I think the justification is that, again, it's context specific. In some cases, it might be the best solution. Maybe not in all
Yeah.
cases, but
Yeah.
in some contexts, it might be.
I'm not very experienced in this kind of field of hydroponics and like every crop can be, let's say if you I know lettuce you can grow hydroponically, but let's say can you grow soy in hydroponic? There are some
Well,
limitations, I presume.
exactly, yeah. So
Ah,
for example, urban food production, urban farming, and the production of vegetables, that might actually be a very good solution. But again, as you said, Evelyn, you maybe cannot produce big amounts of soy in that way.
all right. I just have a question myself. I was just reading a little bit, like you work in the Rethink Action project.
Yes.
Can you tell us about a little bit of the project and like what is the role of the CMCC in this project?
Yeah, so Rethink Action is a Horizon Europe project. Actually, it's Horizon 2020, yes, project dealing with land use based adaptation and mitigation solutions. So it's focused on land use and it deals with both adaptation and mitigation. The final goal of the project is to develop tools to support decision making on which solutions are the best or more effective um, at different scales. So we have the European global level and also um, case studies that allow us to look at the local national level. And the decision support part will be supported by integrated assessment models. So there will be models simulating the effect of solutions. And the role of CMCC and me was to develop the catalog of land use based solutions for adaptation and mitigation. What we did was to revise a large number of policy documents at European and local scale to identify practices or solutions, we call them, for adaptation and mitigation, and then to analyze and characterize them. And then these solutions are going to be or are currently being simulated in the models. And then the outcome will be an online tool where end users can select different options and then they will get suggestions on the best practices they could adopt for their context. And another part of the online tool will be a catalog visualization tool. So if they don't want to run the simulations, they can just consult this catalog of solutions and find information about several practices, again, related to land use. So
Mhm.
it's not any kind of practice. They have to be, I mean, they are related to land.
And this project, is it with different partners across Europe?
Yes, yes. It's coordinated by Cartif, that it's a Spanish research institute, and then it has partners from all over Europe. I don't remember actually how many, um, around 15.
Oh, right.
We just had our second review meeting with the European Commission yesterday, actually.
Mm,
And there's 1 year or 10 months left in the project.
all right. Yeah, it seems like there is a long way to go and a lot to do in terms of like trying to figure out how to adapt and like how to implement these agroecological solutions because there are solutions, but the problem is that it's hard, like maybe sometimes to communicate with farmers and if they would like to kind of implement some of these solutions. Um, I think I'm gonna have to leave it at here because it's already past 1 minute. It's already 9:46. Uh, we have one last, let's do this last question. It says, do you think the ongoing climate change achieving farmland biodiversity objective for the EU, it's possible?
Do you think with the ongoing climate change, achieving well, there is more and more focus on biodiversity in general. So we have now with the nature restoration law, but also um, I don't know. I mean, now I could open a very big parenthesis on this, so I will not do it. I will just mention it. But at the European level, a carbon removal, carbon farming framework is coming up. They are currently developing the methodologies for quantifying and assessing the carbon benefits derived from carbon farming practices. But one of the points about carbon farming in this context is that it has to deliver co-benefits in terms of biodiversity, for example.
Mm.
So at least at the policy level, there is an increasing focus on biodiversity coming from different angles. So we have the Common Agricultural Policy, Nature Restoration Law, now also these credits where farmers can get rewarded for doing things that are beneficial.
Mhm.
So I hope, yes, of course, with climate change, everything is could be more difficult. But again, we need to think that it's theoretically it's beneficial for the farmers herself because you can also gain from it. I mean, your system will be more resilient.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's just like it's a lot of things to think about. I just want to kind of thank you very much. I think this is the time that we had. Um, and thank you everyone for thank you Kiara for joining us and for like
Thank
volunteering
you.
your time to present these insights on your project and then also in general terms of on agroecological practices. And I want to invite everyone for our next talk, which is going to be Dr. Sabina Asins, and she's going to be talking about uh, more than a dialogue between actors, seeking the integration of soil-based principles in agroecological practices. So that's going to be our talk for January 29th, and I'll be sending the invitation to everyone in this webinar. Thank you everyone for your questions, and I'll see you in the next time.